At 8 a.m. on March 28th, we marched through Saint-Menehould, which offered a sad spectacle. This city had been spared by the Germans up to this point, by a strange whim, but for 5 or 6 days now, volleys of shells had fallen. The inhabitants scrambled to get away, like fleeing a cataclysm, some with wagons, some with handcarts or wheelbarrows, or some just carrying on their own backs what they considered most indispensable. In streets and neighbourhoods not yet shelled, the inhabitants hesitated to leave. It's not easy to quit your home, your work, your daily routine, to head out into adventures and misadventures. The fact that we were leaving made an impression on the civilians and bothered them. "Why are you leaving us? Why are you abandoning us?" they said. To the contrary, our departure should have reassured them. If we were being sent elsewhere, it was because our bosses didn't think there'd be an attack right here. As we left the village, an old lady came up to us, carrying something in her apron. They were some eggs which she handed out to us. As I passed by, I managed to snatch one. It's a small thing, an egg, but we were very touched by it. This poor old lady was giving up something necessary for her, to give us this offering. How a gift is made is more important than the gift itself. This was a tough march. Around noon, despite my comrades from time to time carrying my rifle for me, I had to fall out of rank. Our lieutenant told me to keep up as best I could, simply suggesting that I take charge of the laggards at the rear, who were becoming more and more numerous. They were counting on me to buck up the laggards. About 4 p.m., after 10 hours of marching without much of a break, we arrived in a village called Ove. We were lodged in wood-plank barracks. When I got there, I collapsed in a heap without having the strength to take off my gear. My comrades had to pull the pack off my aching shoulders. The captain came to tell us that we had to get to bed early. Next day's march would be even longer. This hardly encouraging news spurred me to go to sick call, to try to get exempted from carrying a pack the next day. Just as I got there, the major medical officer was just closing up. At the sight of me, he got angry. "Another one of them? Why didn't you get here earlier?" "Monsieur le Major, I couldn't keep up with my comrades. I've only just arrived in Ove." "Hold on," he said to his medical corporal. "Let's evacuate this one too, otherwise he'll be nagging us every day. But I'm sure there's nothing wrong with him. It's just that we have to get rid of these people who don't want to do anything," he said in rising anger. My self-interest should have led me to keep quiet and play the idiot, but I was stung and I responded, "Monsieur le Major, since 1914 I've never been evacuated, but now I'm at the end of my strength." "And what about me?" shouted the doctor. "I've been at it since 1914. I've been in Belgium and everywhere else." He didn't even ask what was wrong with me. To his scribe, when he asked what he should put down on my card, he said, "He's got nothing wrong. Put down whatever you want," and turning to me, "Be back here in 20 minutes with all your gear, or else I'm not evacuating you. Do you hear?" Yes, I heard just fine. Despite his unjustified anger toward me, despite his insults, I would have hugged this man's knees, kissed his hands. With wobbly legs, I stumbled back to the cantonment. The squad was eating dinner. The old-timer Son from the Gers grumbled to me, "Well, where have you been hanging out? Too bad for you, we couldn't wait for you. Eat up, friends. Don't worry about me. I'm leaving right away. I'm being evacuated." At these words, forks hung suspended in mid-air. Dumbstruck, the men gazed at me, then their hands reached out to me. I saw their eyes get moist, their voices trembled a little. Would we ever see each other again? Had I really won a bit of esteem, of affection from these gloomy Bretons, always aloof from those who aren't of their race? For as long as I'd been among them, I'd given them all my tobacco and my ration of hooch, precious gifts for the Bretons. That might have had something to do with their regret at my departure. The most afflicted was my friend Son, the only one of the squad from the Midi. Same age as me, just as worn out. My companion bringing up the rear in all the relief details, all the marches. "So," he said to me in a reproachful tone, "you're abandoning me. Tomorrow I'll be the only laggard." Deeply moved, I embraced him, and not finding the words to say, I left without a look back and joined the lame and the halt at the police post. There were 10 of us. By a curious twist of fate, Two were old comrades from my very first squad when I arrived at the front in 1914. They were Donadils from the Tarn, who had just pulled a lucky sprain while horsing around with a comrade, and Sajus from Toulouse, whose feet had gotten bloody the previous winter. They led us to an ambulance, field hospital, which was near the village. It was made up of about 50 barracks buildings capable of housing more than 2,000 wounded, but at that time there were more doctors and nurses than sick. It was farther away from where the storm was bursting and human flesh was being shredded. They gave me a nice, soft bed which I stretched out on with delight. It's not that I was spoiled. This was the first time on the front lines since 1914 that I slept in a real bed. In the morning I heard the regiment waking up in the village getting ready to leave. In a driving rain they marched out on the road alongside the barracks. I pitied my poor comrades. That spoiled my happiness. At 8 o'clock the major showed up, nothing in common with the brute who'd evacuated me. A sympathetic look, a soft word. He asked about my family, and was visibly moved when I told him I'd been manning the trenches since 1914. He prescribed rest and a fortifying diet for me. That's all that I was asking for. In the barracks we were 40 or so of us on sick leave. Every part of the world, every race, every colour was represented. Moroccans, Annamites, Americans both white and black, Italians, etc., and 5 or 6 Frenchmen. When the conversations flowed, you heard quite a cacophony. No poilus right from the trenches, though. They had been snagged in the fishnet, held back in regimental and divisional field stations, which sent them back to their front-line squads as soon as they were healed, without a single day of leave. Farther to the rear, behind a capriciously drawn line parallel to the front, the sick and the wounded benefited from at least 10 days of convalescence. Happily for me, the Ove Field Hospital was on the right side of the demarcation line, and you could get 10 days of convalescence at home, with the condition that you had to have been there at the hospital at least 10 days. That's what everyone hoped for, and it was rare that the medical officers sent them away without granting the full 10 days, except for the Americans and the Annamites, whom they couldn't exactly send to San Francisco or Hanoi for 10 days. On April 6th, they decided to evacuate me to Chalon-sur-Marne. My buddies treated me like a lucky devil. It seemed I had a stroke of rare good luck. I was following the right path, the one that took me away from the front lines. I owed this happy decision to my skeletal skinniness and the help of the head corpsman for whom I'd done some small favours, updating his logbook, cleaning the room, etc. That same day, at noon, I embarked from the Ove train station with 2 big Moroccan troopers evacuated like me and put in my charge. This was easy duty, since these 2 Lascars weren't about to escape. For them, a stay in hospital was a pasha's life. I was supposed to drop one of them off along the way at the village field hospital in Saint-Hilaire-au-Temple. At the Saint-Hilaire station, I gave him his papers and asked him to get off the train, but he didn't understand a word of French, nor did his comrade, and it took a long time for him to comprehend. When he finally got it, he refused to get off. He didn't want to leave his compatriot. Luckily, 2 gendarmes who were on duty there succeeded in getting him out of the compartment. The train left 10 minutes late. At 3 p.m. the train entered the station at Chalon. It gave me goosebumps to see what condition the station was in, since from the start of the German offensive the Gothas came almost every night and dropped a few bombs right on it. I had to present myself at the first aid station. It took a while to find it because it had helpfully moved its location. During the half hour it took me to ferret it out in a funk hole dug into the railway embankment, some military policeman, intrigued by the distracted air of my Moroccan companion, hauled him off to the police station, despite his vain and unintelligible protests. I freed him from the clutches of the gendarmes who had taken him for a deserter. A minute later we made our entrance to the Février hospital. A paper scratcher put me through an interrogation worthy of a prosecutor. He even asked me what religion I professed, in case I left the hospital in a pine box, so they'd know who to send along with me. A priest, a pastor, a rabbi, or maybe I wanted to take the journey all by myself. They planned ahead at this hospital. I was then led to a building called Pavilion B, and pushed into a room where I barely had time to read on the door the not very reassuring label saying bronchitis patients. All those with tuberculosis went by this name of bronchitis patients. Less frightening, they supposed. Next morning, 9 a.m., we had a visit from a vulgar-looking medical officer with a scowling face, stingy with his words, which were often harsh and hurtful, also stingy with medication. "He's a scab," my bunkmates often said. "He hates Poilus and thinks we're all liars. If he alone were in charge, nobody would spend any time here at all." He hardly deigned to look at me and hear my story. He moved on to the next one. "What shall I put down for him?" asked the head nurse who followed him, notebook in her hand. "Why, nothing at all," said this poor excuse for a medical officer optimistically. "He isn't sick. Since he doesn't seem to be digesting well, we could give him a little brand of mineral water," the nurse insisted. "Not at all. I've told you he isn't sick. Just put him on a light diet." Now there was a good prescription for fattening me up. I guess he didn't think I was skinny enough. Nevertheless, the nurse whispered to me, "I'll get you something." In this hospital we were taken care of by nurses, most of whom were young and pretty. There was also a swarm of housekeepers, cooks, laundresses, etc. The menial jobs were done by Annamites. I guess the bosses thought they were doing them a favour and an honour, and giving them a sense of doing something worthwhile, by making them empty the spittoons and clean the latrines. Our ward nurse looked to be about 25. I don't know whether she was reserving all her warmth and kindness for the love of her life, but she was somewhat cold and distant to the patients. She showed up in the ward only to make her rounds, and then she disappeared right away. One day the doctor, making his rounds, roughly yanked the bedding off a patient and yanked his nightshirt up. The nurse had been looking elsewhere, but when her eyes suddenly fell upon this specimen of a man in the state of Adam, she turned bright red with embarrassment and did a quick pirouette, just as if a snake had bitten her on the heel. This didn't go down well with the patients, who criticised her when she left the ward. They said that a nurse doing her duty with true heart and devotion shouldn't show any repugnance. One morning we had a visit to the ward from the hospital's chief doctor, Dr. Desjonc, who before the war had run a clinic in Paris, a venerable figure radiating intelligence with sparkling, gimlet-sharp eyes. He gave everyone a good, hard look, stopping here and there to find out what was up. "And this one, what's wrong with him?" he said, pointing to a new arrival proposed for non-combat service. "Basta! Enough!" replied our ward's major. "Nothing at all. I don't see anything wrong with him." But the doctor was already bending over, tapping the patient on the chest. "What?" he said, standing up straight. "You don't find anything? Give him a tap, here and here." But the other one persisted in hearing nothing, understanding nothing. With a dry tone, the doctor said to his colleague, who was turning from red to deep crimson, "I don't want to make this one out to be sicker than he really is, but there is something wrong with him. As for you, I think you're going deaf." If we had dared, we would have applauded these words with all our hearts, but the mocking looks we exchanged with each other were full of significance. Every Saturday, the medicine chef himself examined in his office the sick men who had arrived during the week and passed judgment on their fates. That's how I got my turn to appear before this eminent person, at whose side stood our ward's major, who declared as soon as he saw me that I had nothing wrong with me, that I was complaining about vague aches and pains. He didn't know precisely where, nor apparently did I know. I protested, thin as I was, that I was on my last ounce of strength, worn out by uninterrupted duty in the trenches since 1914. "Come on," the médecin chef said to me soothingly. "You haven't saved France all by yourself. You haven't spent 3.5 years at the Petit Poste." "No, Monsieur le Major, but 3.5 years in a regiment holding the front lines, where I spent 4 long winters." He got me to undress, to lie down on a table. Then he listened to my chest. "Yes," he said, "this man is worn out. We're going to send him to the rear." Then I just had to wait my turn to depart, the trains sanitaires, hospital trains, being infrequent. I wouldn't have been in a particular hurry to leave Chalons, except for the nocturnal visits by the sinister Gothas, which were destroying the city bit by bit. The tenacious inhabitants, who nevertheless remained, were obliged to seek shelter every evening in underground cellars 2 kilometers from the city. This daily exodus of people, of women, old men, children, carrying their blankets, their mattresses, their pillows, their cradles, was truly lamentable. With the arrival of night, a gloomy solitude, a deathly silence, weighed down upon the city, which seemed altogether dead. But the hospitals couldn't be evacuated, and nothing could protect us. We were at the mercy of the Gothas. Doors and windows were locked to keep us from fleeing. You can imagine our fright, our anguish when we heard the sinister birds of death droning over our heads. But during my stay there, no bomb fell on the hospital or the immediate neighbourhood. One night I felt my blanket being pulled off me. I lit a match and shuddered with horror. My neighbour was vomiting gobs of blood from his mouth and his nose, which gushed out onto my bunk. It was a young Parisian with lungs burned by poison gas. He couldn't speak and pulled my blanket off to wake me up. I quickly ran to the ward's office, where an Annamite guard was on duty, or rather was dozing, and after 5 minutes of wild gestures to get him to understand, sent him to find the night duty nurse. Very soon a nurse and a major were at the sick man's bedside. A few injections, a few compresses stopped the hemorrhaging for now, but every day thereafter he spat up blood, and when I left Chalons he was dying. Finally, April 21st, it was my turn to leave Chalons, destination unknown. The next day the train was in the Brotteaux station in Lyon, where we were served a meal. We were very happy to be hospitalized in this big city, where we thought a bevy of beautiful ladies and ravishing young girls would be clamouring to take care of us. But we had to be disabused of these notions. Our meals digested, we got back on the train, which headed for Grenoble. Before we left Chalons, they gave each of us an envelope to be handed over when we got to our destination, containing our diagnosis. This envelope was sealed, but naturally every one of us broke his open without the slightest scruple. I read on my card, general fatigue, suspicious rattles in the upper right lung. Well, this diagnosis wasn't very reassuring. Neither was that of most of my comrades. But it didn't seem possible to us that after all the bursting shells, machine guns, poison gas, exploding mines, etc., one could die just from getting sick. That was just too silly. Joy was on all our faces. You'd have thought we were just ordinary folks leaving on a holiday train trip and not a train of tubercular, hernia or cardiac patients. In the afternoon, our train dropped us off in the little town of Bourgoin, in the Isère, département. We were driven to a convalescent hospital installed within the buildings of a mill and foundry, where several hundred men and women were employed, right beside the vast park and chateau of the proprietor Diederic's. We were the guests of one of the biggest war profiteers. At his own expense, he funded this hospital as a deduction from his profits. At Chalons, we'd been shut up like prisoners. Here, in contrast, complete freedom to wander around town or the countryside, any time between the morning rounds and the evening roll call at 9 p.m, like at Auve, like at Chalons, and doubtless like everywhere else. I observed that out of 100 patients, at least 50 had nothing wrong with them, or hardly anything. They exploited or exaggerated some little fault in their well-being, or faked or pretended some small illness, using techniques which were whispered along by word of mouth, from coming down with a fever and rattling the bronchial tubes, to making your eyes red or making pus come out of your ears, at the risk of going deaf or blind. I'd have been curious to know how many dressing stations, field hospitals and clinics functioned during the war, and how many patients, or pseudo-patients, they sheltered, along with legions of nurses, orderlies, stretcher-bearers, medical officers, pencil-pushers. And out there, in the forward observation posts, there often weren't enough men to relieve the sentries who had to do double shifts, watching from their firing steps. But you'd have to admit that there were plenty who really were sick. The gassed, the tubercular, the weak-hearted, they formed the majority. I had as my bunkmate a fellow who had epileptic seizures resulting from shell fire. These attacks would seize him suddenly, when he least expected them, while playing cards or in bed, or in the middle of a quiet conversation. He rolled on the floor like a madman, eyes bulging out of their sockets, teeth clattering, foaming at the mouth. Once back to his senses, He didn't remember what had happened. He didn't once dare to venture into town. He would walk only in the park of the chateau, where I would accompany him. In my ward there was also a young man named Joseph, whom you could have called Josephine, because practically everything about him was ladylike. High voice, round breasts, beardless face, curvy hips. Only about a tenth of him was male, the part that would permit him to exercise his masculine duties. The major had said to him, "I don't know why they called you up. I can't tell if you're a man or a woman." This poor Joseph, we called him Jojo, told me that he was worried about being sent home on convalescent leave. His parents were dead, and his two sisters made clear that it would be a big bother for them to take him in. He also had a brother who was a priest, but who didn't want him around because he had a young niece at home. "As if I'd be any danger," he said with tears in his eyes. "Me, almost a woman myself." The truth was that in their household, growing up, Jojo was Mama's and Papa's favourite, and the others were jealous and had no love for him. I told him about the work of the godfathers of Neuilly. I wrote up a request for him, which was accepted, and he was able to have his convalescence in a place like that. In any hospital, those who were merely sick, whether cured or not, soon had to make room for new arrivals, more and more numerous in these months of steadily worse and worse combat before the war's end. But anyone who could make himself useful doing any kind of chores could stay the maximum length of time, that's to say 2 months, followed by a long convalescent leave. As for myself, I made myself useful in the hospital office. That's how I was able to meet the section's chief medical officer, a redoubtable person who could determine your fate with the stroke of his pen. "What?" he said to me. "You haven't had a day of sick leave since 1914? That's not possible." "Monsieur le Major, I've had a couple of little discomforts, but I was determined not to be evacuated." This bombastic statement pleased him no end, and he told me, "Well, we're going to give you the nice long rest you deserve." He first wanted to send me to a sanatorium. I made a face. Sure, it would be better to live with unfortunate people coughing out their lungs than to die alongside the able-bodied in the trenches. Nevertheless, what I really wanted, not having seen my loved ones in 6 months, was to leave right away for home. I explained to the Major that I lived in the country, and the fresh air and the care of my family would restore me completely in no time. This considerate Major recommended 2 months of convalescence, which the medical board approved 2 days later. With a heart full of joy, I left Bourgoin on June 8th, having spent a month and a half of quiet rest, away from the horrors of the front. I left Bourgoin at 8 in the evening. At 10 I was in Lyon, at the Gare Perrache, where there was a huge crowd of military men of all branches and all colours, despite home leaves having been suspended. It was hard to find a place in the huge dining hall where, for modest prices, you could get food, fruit and drink at the guichets, shop windows. No train for Poilus until 7 in the morning, but at 1 a first-class train was due to pass through, bound for the Côte d'Azur, which wouldn't even pick up civilian passengers at the Lyon station. I overheard some Marseillais plotting to work their way onto this train of privileged types. I joined in with them. As soon as the train started to pull out, we threw ourselves against the platform gates, just as if we were storming an enemy position. And there we were, on the train, before the station employees could stop us. The strict conductors took down our names and numbers, and vowed we'd be put off at the next stop, Valence, and be handed over to the military authorities. At Valence we disembarked quietly. But just like at Lyon, as soon as the train started up again, we made a dash for the gates. This time most of us were held back by the station crews repulsing the assailants. I managed to fly through a gate which wasn't guarded and plunked myself down quietly at the end of a railway car corridor. I was duly warned that I would be put off at Avignon and handed over to the station police there, which left me utterly cold. I offered to pay my way. They refused. Even paying poilus weren't welcome on this train. It just would not do to have crude, dusty, muddy creatures like us offending the fine messieurs and their belles dames lounging on the soft banquette cushions. You should have seen the disdain with which they looked at me, crouched in my corner. Several times the conductors swore at me, threatened me. They were sturdy, healthy lads, and you'd be amazed to see such slackers. I wasn't shy about telling one of them so. Then came time for the déjeuner. From the wagon restaurant, the obsequious waiters brought trays of plates to the pampered passengers. What a contrast between the luxury, the well-being of the insolent rich pursuing their pleasures, having a whole train to themselves, a few dozen parasites, and this soldier chewing on a crust of brown bread, viewed as an intruder, a mangy dog, a beggar. I could see for sure that my presence bothered them, spoiled their appetite, troubled their digestion. That's understood. For them, I was a living reproach, though mute. I represented those who suffered, who were being tortured, who were dying in a hellish place to protect their property, their fortunes, their privileges. Here we are at Avignon. As soon as the train stopped, a conductor marches me toward the police station. But here's a long freight train stopped in our path. While he's asking a yard worker if there's an underground passage, I sneak between two freight cars and hightail it away at full speed. I never saw that conductor again. An hour later, I left Avignon on an express train and was home that very evening. I'll skip over the 2 months I spent with my loved ones. Sometimes I went so far as to believe it was all over, that I had taken up my former life again, forever. But alas, August 10, I had to put on my uniform once again. I'd thrown it in a corner, and tear myself away from the affection of my family. But this time the separation wasn't as cruel as before, because I wasn't going straight back to the front. I was taking the garrison route. This mysterious garrison duty, full of unknowns, object of the dreams of every poilu on the front lines. But often it was only a short step to the training companies where there was no rest. 3 weeks later, you're on your way back to the trenches. The next day at 10 I left for Paris, or Paname, as it was called by the Parisian poilus, who never called anything by its real name. At the station which bears the name of the massacre of Austerlitz, I wanted to take the metro which would get me to the Gare Montparnasse. I was amazed to be climbing a staircase. The metro ran right on top of the roof of the station. Funny. There I was, en route, or rather en metro. We went along a viaduct overlooking a boulevard, then we barreled underground. I discovered that this train didn't go to the Gare Montparnasse. They advised me to get off at a stop, which brought me to an almost deserted boulevard. I had to ask 10 times for directions to the Gare Montparnasse. Once I got there, I had to climb a big staircase to reach the waiting room on the first floor, at the same level as the tracks. I saw written on a big board that the first train for Brest wouldn't be leaving until 8. I decided to explore the capital. After stowing my gear, I hopped on the first tram I saw leaving, which took me first to the Place de la Bastille, noteworthy only for the gloomy, bloody, or, if you like, glorious, memories it evokes. There I jumped on another tram, and then another one. By chance in my wanderings I saw the lawmaking factory, the Chambre des Députés, which didn't seem to deserve the pompous title of palace. You'd think you were looking at a district court or a modest sub-prefecture with its pillars. I passed near the Eiffel Tower with its admiring crowds of American soldiers, and the big Ferris wheel, which seemed like an enormous toy. I saw the towers of Notre Dame in profile, and the front of the aristocratic Madeleine Church. I paraded indifferently through the Arc de Triomphe, walked down the Champs-Élysées and crossed the Place de la Concorde. I passed in front of the hangout of patriotic President Poincaré, the Élysée Palace. Its exterior appearance disappointed me. It reminded me of a convent, a barracks, a prison surrounded by walls and low buildings. I'm sure I passed by many places worthy of being admired, but alone, without a guide, I had to be happy with seeing whatever fate had me come upon. Finally I got lost, and I was going to miss my train. In fact, it left without me. Luckily, there was a half train leaving 20 minutes after. These few hours of sightseeing in Paris allowed me to see the friendliness of Parisians, all very eager to offer directions. At the doors of shops where people were waiting in line, the poilu went right to the front and was helped right away. 2 or 3 times, the lady tram conductors pretended not to see me. One of them said to me, "Keep your 3 sous, my brother's a soldier too." I was shocked by what some Parisian women wore. Were they part of high society or respectable folk, or the courtesans? I couldn't tell. Unbuttoned, hardly covered at all, bare arms and shoulders, Their sole purpose seemed to be to please, to be noticed, to attract attention, to spark the desire of passers-by. And this at the time when anguish that was afflicting so many hearts, when so many eyes that were weeping, hung in the balance. This left me scandalized, but nobody around me seemed to be bothered by it. Everyone seemed to find this perfectly natural. This was when the Big Bertha shells were falling on Paris, but I don't think any struck during the day I was there. Here and there I saw a few damaged buildings. They lasted for a few days and ended long before Paris was turned into a pile of ruins. Besides, a falling shell didn't make a very big impression due to the incessant street noise in that huge city. The next day at dawn, I was in Brittany. My eyes saw a rather monotonous landscape. Woods, pastures, fields, succeeding each other, in the middle of which popped up, here and there, some farms with grey walls and thatched roofs. An indefinable melancholy pervaded this ancient terrain. At 6 in the morning I was at Gamp, a city of 12,000 inhabitants. It stretched out in a long line, the train station at one end and the barracks where I was headed at the other. The walk was about 2 kilometres. The barracks looked just like any other. That's not where you find any marvels of architecture. Above the main entrance was inscribed Caserne de la Tour d'Auvergne. I wasn't particularly flattered to enter this place where such a great hero was honoured. I look on heroes with horror. Their hands are stained with blood. After signing in on the official register, the true cogwheel of militarism, I went to the garrison, which was the headquarters of the 3 regiments of infantrymen, of which the city of Gamp was so proud. The barracks was reserved for the future heroes of the conscript class of 1920, which was finishing up its apprenticeship in the noble profession of arms. As for us, the greybeards, the leather skins, the tough old guys of every shade and hue, we had to be content being housed in what had been the stables for remounts. There were no more than a half-dozen stallions still there, the care of which required the presence of 3 or 4 dozen embusqués. I didn't receive a very warm welcome at the office. It seemed that I was arriving 3 days late. I had left home the day after my convalescence leave had expired. But there were several days which the dictator Clemenceau, to get the sick and the wounded back to the front lines more quickly, had decreed that any delays in travel would henceforth be included in the home leave or convalescence. I didn't know that. But no one is allowed to be ignorant of the law, even a decree. So they told me that I would be called before the generalissimo of all the troops in Gamp, who would decide whether or not I'd be considered a deserter. Next day I was sent to the barracks for the obligatory medical exam. Despite a gruff exterior and sour manner, the major medical officer harboured a kind heart and did everything in his power to help the poilus. Observing my skinny body, my haggard features, the bags under my eyes, and learning that I'd been evacuated for the first time in 4 years, he said to me, "Good man, go get your gear. You're coming to the infirmary. You'll help work in the garden." The next day I began my peaceful duties as assistant gardener, watering the cabbages and lettuce, pulling up potatoes, all kinds of things which appealed much more to my pacifist temperament than handling a rifle, grenades, and other homicidal devices. But back at the barracks, where my transfer to the infirmary had at first gone unnoticed, they looked for me everywhere, calling Barthas to appear before the commandant. They ended up deciding that I had indeed deserted for good, and they were about to alert all the police stations in the vicinity, when finally some clerk discovered on the sick roster that I'd gone back to the infirmary. The hospital or infirmary is a sacred temple, at the threshold of which the external power and discipline cease. I was saved. They didn't bother me any more about this. At the infirmary there reigned as absolute authority a young and pretty nurse called La Blanchette, because she was dressed in white from head to toe. Every morning she would get all the patients to work, washing, scraping, sweeping the staircases, corridors, lavatories, etc. Nobody even thought of sleeping in. Anyone who tried to sneak out of these chores or question her authority didn't last long at the infirmary. But if you knew how to get into her good graces, you could spend 2 quiet months there. That's all the rules allowed. We were prisoners, in a way. Only on Sunday, from noon to 4 p.m., we were driven to the edge of Gamp by a non-com and allowed to wander around the countryside. But this had less appeal than a nice afternoon spent at a bistro. But woe to anyone who had the bad luck of finding La Blanchette in his path. The next day, the doors of the infirmary would be wide open for you. You were free to go. But from the infirmary prison, the only place you'd go would be a retraining camp, leading right to the hell of the front lines. One day an order was posted that all non-coms in the garrison could, upon request, be assigned to Vitre to train the group of instructors of the conscript class of 1920, just about to be called up. This was like tossing up a lifesaver, 3 or 4 months assured, far from the bad stuff. I declared to the major that I was healed and I signed up. To be sure, I wasn't happy about learning how to teach a profession that I abhorred, but saving my life imposed this sacrifice. And then there was the attraction of a home leave of 7 days granted to all those who took up this assignment. I left that very evening. This time, passing through Paris, I visited the Palais des Invalides, but I couldn't see the red marble tomb of that great battler Napoleon I because it was covered with sandbags to protect it from enemy bombs. That would have been quite a paradox if the murderer who had never suffered a scratch during more than 100 battles would have been touched by a piece of metal a century later in his coffin. On September 8th, in the morning, I was back at Gamp. That September 8th, the same day I got back from home leave, along with 30 corporals, sergeants and adjutants, I took the train to Vitre. At Saint-Brieuc, the station crew told us there was a 40-minute stop. I shared my compartment with 2 corporals whose names I've forgotten. These 2 decided to take a little tour of the town. Tired out, I decided not to join them. It's a good thing I didn't, because the train left sooner than we'd been told, before the return of my 2 companions. Arriving at Vitre, I reported this to the section chief, who gathered up all the gear of the 2 missing persons, who were coming along on the next train, and took it off the train. Nothing happened as a result. But what if I had followed my 2 comrades in Saint-Brieuc, and all 3 of us had missed the train? No one would have missed us at Vitre, in the middle of the night, in a pouring rain, under nobody's authority. Since Messieurs les Officiers had granted themselves the right to get off at Rennes, where would our knapsacks, canteens and weapons have gotten to? We would have been in a fine mess. At 9 in the evening we showed up at La Tremoille barracks, where our arrival took the guard detail completely by surprise and disturbed their sleep. The teams of instructors weren't supposed to arrive until the next day. As a result, we didn't get a very warm welcome. We had to skip supper and slept on beds without mattresses. We consoled ourselves with the thought that we'd seen plenty of those. The day after, our apprenticeship in the noble profession of soldiering began. From dawn to twilight, we were either in the barracks courtyard or snaking our way across the training field, with barely an hour of rest, hardly enough time to wolf down something to eat, write a letter, look at a newspaper, all at full gallop. We spent hours doing to the left march, right face, showing off for a boss who was never satisfied with how smartly we clicked our heels, marching past him in full salute 20 times in a row, while he shouted commands to us so loudly as to burst a vein in his neck. It's tough enough to take these monkey shines when you're 20. What about at 40, after already doing your 3 years of military service, and then 3 years on the front lines? I'd get red in the face with shame, but I did the best I could, so as not to be sent back for being an inept instructor. But from my very first days there, it was clear that I didn't have the proper military attitude. The officers reproached me for the lack of energy in my gestures, suppleness in my movements. But to fix those, I'd need to change my wobbly legs and my aching back. Nevertheless, I got my revenge. Nature, in one of her rare gifts to me, had blessed me with a good memory. As daunting as I found the study of these stupidities and ineptitudes of military theory, I could spew out all the nonsense to the astonishment of the officers who couldn't have recited them to save their lives, and to that of my comrades, most of whom couldn't put 3 words together without looking like idiots. Every day there were choral sessions, and we sang going to and from the training field. It was forced cheerfulness. We had 2 priests with us who sang La Madeleine, Margoton, La Boulangère, so often as to give you a headache. That didn't keep them from singing Mass every morning at a church in Vitre, and getting paid for it. Vitre is a city of about 10,000 inhabitants. The people are Bretons because they're part of Brittany, but they aren't Breton in their customs or their language. They speak only French, and it would be a pretty good French if they didn't say, for example, Vitren for Vitre, Marchan for Marché, Sévignan for Sévigné, etc., for every word ending in E. Right in the city is the ancient, admirably conserved castle of the Seigneur de la Trémoille, the big brawler whom Vitre holds dear to its heart. At the base of this castle flows the Vilaine River, which deserves its name. It's not pretty to look at, with its muddy water, dirtied, they say, by factories located upstream. Vitre's local celebrity is Madame de Sévigné, who lived in the Black Rock Castle, a few kilometres outside town, a place of excursion and even pilgrimage for any traveller passing by. In the public garden at Vitre, they've raised a statue of Madame de Sévigné. She's shown with an inoffensive pen in her hand. I much prefer that to a brandished sword, battle-axe or rifle. One day our officers were nice enough to drive us to the former Château des Roches Noires. We could see the writing room of the person who made this place famous. Everything was exactly the same as she left it. In one corner, her tiny wooden shoes were there to show how small her feet were. In the park there was a sort of grotto which produced unexpected echoes. I shouted, "Long live peace! May this cry echo around the world and reach the ears of the people's false shepherds." One afternoon we were driven to the theatre of Vitre, not to see a performance but to hear a speech about American war aid, so as to boost our morale, which risked being sapped by the pacifist, or as they called it, defeatist campaign, which was rife at this time. So here was this young officer, embusqué, this charlatan of morale, pouring into our ears fantastic numbers of cannon, airplanes, tanks, Yankees armed to the teeth flooding in. At the end of each tirade, to conclude it, he cried out 2 or 3 times, "Qu'est formidable! Qu'est formidable!" First came the smiles, then the muffled laughter, then the guffaws bursting forth irreverently. The officers had a hard time keeping a straight face, and the successor to de la Trémoille himself, the military governor of Vitre, chewed on his big grey moustaches. At the end, the speaker himself was caught up in the laughter which rocked the hall, and the conference ended in the midst of general hilarity. The funniest thing was that this emissary of Clemenceau had no idea about the reason for this hilarity, and continued to punctuate each of his sentences, full of conviction, with "C'est formidable, c'est formidable." Meanwhile, the great drama was reaching its conclusion. Alone against 20 nations baying after her in a fantastic clamour, Germany, so proud in 1914, now on its knees, asked for mercy, asked for armistice. But this way of fleeing the war didn't appeal to the striped sleeves, who didn't have their fill of crosses, medals, stars, stripes, ribbons, honours and glories. For these folks, war had to end with total disaster for the German army, against which Jena, Waterloo and Sedan would be mere skirmishes. Thousands of captured cannon, hundreds of thousands of captured Boches, shattered enemy forces streaming back across the Rhine bridges, pursued with bayonets at their backs by our soldiers, our regiments entering the great cities beyond the Rhine, flags fluttering, bands playing. Here was the apotheosis dreamed of not only by our great warriors, but also by the government, almost all the press, all the embusqués, and back in the rear, all those who had nothing more to lose, or who had more to gain by continuing the war. What did 100,000, 200,000 more cadavers matter? A few more months of unimaginable suffering to bear. Did that matter for those who were far from the slugfest? And to accomplish this monstrous dream, the so-called Allied governments sought to delay for as long as possible the hour of the last cannon shot, by requiring Germany to repeat its demand for armistice several times, for simple questions of form and formulas. During this time, in an orgy of murder, bloodletting and burning, the whole front was in flames, from Ypres to Belfort. Without exception, all the regiments were thrown into the assault on German machine guns. The German armies bent back on all the points of contact, without letting their line be broken, and their retreat didn't turn into a rout. They had to cede the floor to the diplomats. But I'm not going to pretend to write history here, by recounting the dramatic, agonizing twists and turns which led to the signing of the armistice, November 11th, 1918, at 5 in the morning. The big bosses themselves didn't believe that things would end so soon. Evidence: 2 days before the armistice, we arrived at the barracks at 11, our appetites sharpened by 3 or 4 hours of exercise. We believed we were going to eat our meagre meal, when we had the disagreeable surprise of discovering in our courtyard the commander of the military district, the famous General Damard, renowned for his exploits in the colonies. The general had no doubt dined well. He was in no hurry. He had us assemble, he congratulated the officers, stopped here and there before some poilus, asked various questions, then finally gave us the patriotic sales pitch. Finishing up, no doubt believing this would please us, he assured us that victory is certain, but the war isn't over, and we still have laurels to gather up. Thanks to these laurels, this end of the speech spoiled our appetites, and we went back to our rooms pensive and careworn. It was noon when the news reached us in the Vittoria barracks. There wasn't a single soldier left in the rooms. It was a devilish stampede down the corridors and down to the police station, where they had just posted a telegram announcing, in 2 laconic lines, the deliverance of millions of men, the end of their tortures, the imminent return to civilized life. How many times had we thought about this blessed day, which so many did not live to see? How many times had we peered into the mysterious future, looking for this star of salvation, this invisible lighthouse in the dark night? And now this forever immortal day had arrived. This happiness, this joy, overwhelmed us. We couldn't keep it in our hearts. We stood there looking at each other, mute and stupid. But we were called back to reality by the cries of rassemblement, assembly, and the whistle blasts of the adjutants on duty to head out for exercises as usual. What? To exercises? On such a solemn day, which will be unforgettable in future centuries, that was a joke. Grumbling, we set out for the training field, and the next day too. Finally, some striped sleeve type, less stupid than the others, put an end to these exercises which had lost their purpose. 3 days later, we were in Gamp. But for our trip there, someone had the intelligence to put us on a train which wasn't direct, and we had to spend the night on the benches of the waiting room at Rennes. I soon obtained a leave of 50 days as a barrel maker, and returned to duty at the garrison on the 10th of January 1919. Passing through Paris, I visited the Jardin des Plantes and walked past the Opera and the Louvre. 1 more month separated me from my liberation. I spent it standing guard at the 48th Regiment's barracks and at a hospital where German prisoners from all over the region were being cared for. They were installed by themselves in 2 big tents at the end of the hospital's garden. If you were too sick, you died, and there's one less Bosch. No daily examination rounds for them. Just once a week, a major would pass by and decide, based on appearance, those who were ready or who looked to be ready to rejoin the prison camp they'd come from. One day I was assigned to go with 4 soldiers to take a dozen of these cured prisoners to their cantonment in Saint-Brieuc. Their prison was a school in town. We arrived there at the moment they were serving a meal, made up only of rice cooked in water with a few pieces of low-grade meat floating in it, bits of skin, tendon, fat, etc. You could have as much rice as you wanted. Those who liked this plat du jour could have as much as they wanted. Others who had some money could buy some delicacies. In one corner of the courtyard, a profiteer had set up a table loaded with cans of preserves, chocolate, etc. All the sous from the meagre purses of the prisoners went right to the pockets of this profiteer. We spent the rest of the day visiting Saint-Brieuc, which was separated from the sea by steeply embanked ravines. On one square stands the statue of a former town mayor killed by the Chouans, who one night took over Saint-Brieuc and opened the gates of prisons, releasing men who were condemned to die the very next day. Finally, my long-awaited day arrived, February 14th, 1919. That day at Narbonne, after multiple formalities imposed upon the demobilized and visits from one office to another, a desk-bound adjutant handed me my discharge papers with the words, as long awaited as the Messiah, "Go, you're free." I was free after 54 months of slavery. I was finally escaping from the claws of militarism, to which I swore such a ferocious hatred. I have sought to inculcate this hatred in my children, my friends, my neighbours. I will tell them that the fatherland, glory, military honour, laurels, all are only vain words. destined to mask what is frighteningly horrible, ugly, and cruel about war. To keep up morale during this war, to justify it, they lied cynically, saying that we were fighting just for the triumph of right and justice, that they were not guided by ambition, no colonial covetousness or financial or commercial interests. They lied when they said that we had to push right to the end, so that this would be the last of all wars. They lied when they said that we, the poilus, wanted to continue the war in order to avenge the dead, so that our sacrifices would not be useless. They lied. But I'm not going to write any more about the lies which came out of the mouths or the pens of our governors or journalists. Victory has made us forget everything, absolve everything. Our leaders needed it at all cost to save themselves. And to get it, they would have sacrificed the whole human race, as General Castelnau said. In the villages, they're already talking about raising monuments of glory, of apotheosis, to the victims of the big butchery, to those, as the phony patriots say, who have voluntarily made the sacrifice of their lives, as if those unfortunate ones could have chosen to do otherwise. I'll contribute my penny only if the monuments symbolize a vehement protest against war and the warrior spirit, and do not exalt or glorify such a death so as to incite future generations to follow the example of these reluctant martyrs. Ah, if the dead of this war could come out of their tombs, how they would shatter these monuments of hypocritical pity, because those who are erecting have sacrificed these dead without pity. Who has dared to cry out, "Enough blood spilled, enough dead, enough suffering"? Who has refused to turn in his gold, his silver, his paper money, publicly, in the war bond drives, to keep the war going? Returned to the bosom of my family after the nightmare years, I taste the joy of life, or rather of new life. I feel tender happiness about things which, before, I didn't pay attention to. Sitting at home, at my table, lying in my bed, putting off sleep so I can hear the wind hitting the shutters, rustling the nearby plane trees, hearing the rain strike the windows, looking at a starry, serene, silent night, or on a dark, moonless night, thinking about similar nights spent up there. Often I think about my many comrades fallen by my side. I heard their curses against the war and its authors, the revolt of their whole beings against their tragic fate, against their murder. And I, as a survivor, believe that I am inspired by their will to struggle without ceasefire nor mercy, to my last breath, for the idea of peace and human fraternity. February 1919.